Nearly Over by Thomas Thursday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Braymiller. Nearly Over by Thomas Thursday. A setback only had the effect of making Sweeney try harder than ever to smash into print with one of his marvelous stories. In fact, after his distasteful work was finished for the day at the Crookometer factory, he would dash back to the room and proceed to hatch out new plots by the score. No trouble at all. He became also an expert typewriter player, and, after only 6 months' practice, managed to reel off a full sheet of paper without making more than 10 or 15 mistakes. Not bad, eh? Of course, you must bear in mind that Jeff used only 2 fingers, one on each hand, while other stenogs had to use all. He assured me that he had the new noiseless touch system down pat. But, unfortunately, the goop that camped in the next room didn't appreciate the noiseless part of the system, because one night he shouted through the keyhole, "Why don't you guys bring up a hand organ? I'm tired of hearing that pile-driving machine of yours. Play on something else for a change." Jeff paid no attention to the poor chap's raving, and kept right on banging away until he had finished his new story. And it was some story. Personally, I thought, well, here's what Jeff thinks about it. I'll admit, Jim, that in writing The Mender of Broken Hearts, I'm catering to the taste and appetites of girls under 20 and those over 40. But we can use a little coin, can't we? I figured it all out, and I'm dead sure that I've written one of the greatest mush stories ever attempted. It's on the style of that guy Harold Ding Dong Left, and there's enough tears in it to promote a miniature ocean, believe me. You know that I don't care to lower myself to scribble stuff like that. But since 90% of the girls are not happy unless they have something to cry over, far be it from me to stop them enjoying themselves. What magazine do you think will pay the highest price for it, Jim? I'd advise you to shoot it to the Eversob Monthly. That's just about their speed, I think. How much do they slip you? I don't know, Jeff. They ought to pay at least 2 cents a word for a story like that. It's a novelette, isn't it? Yeah, I guess you could call it that and get away with it. It's about 100 typewritten pages, and there's a little over 25,000 words mixed up in it. What's the difference between a novelette and a novel, Jeff? Well, in my opinion, Jim, novelettes are always started with the idea of writing a novel, but the goop that's writing it runs dry in the middle. The only thing he can do then is throw in some kind of reasonable finish and label it novelette. And what would you call a novel? As a rule, a novel is a thin short story that's fattened with about 60,000 words used in the descriptions of trees, moonlight, and the hair of the leading dame. Then what's a short story? That's a cinch to answer. A short story is nothing but the scenario of a novel. Jeff yawned a little and made arrangement to place his feet in a more comfortable position upon the bureau. By the way, Jeff, Mrs. Snickers told me this morning that the typewriter man was around looking for some dough, I said, changing the subject. Well, he'll get paid just as soon as some of those dyspeptic editors slip me some coin. It won't be the first bill he's muffed in his lifetime, believe me, he replied in a bored manner. You see, we had purchased a typewriter on the hide-and-seek plan, and Mrs. Snickers, our landlady, told me very politely that she didn't care to have the good name of her boarding house embarrassed by having a choice assortment of installment collectors wear out the doorbell. Say, Jim, where's the Eversob Monthly published? Out in Minicago, Idaconsin, I informed him. Good night. That's extra postage, isn't it? Well, it's only a few cents more, but think of the coin you're going to get for it, I shot back enthusiastically. All right, then. I'll give that bird the first crack at it. And he did. 2. 2 weeks later, the editor of the Eversob Monthly gave Jeff an opportunity to test his lungs in the approved manner. Listen to Jeff. Believe me, Jim, the only thing that separates that editor from a crepe-colored eye is about $15 worth of railroad fare. Take it from me, if that goop had his office here in Clevelado, I'd be in jail long ago. He thinks he's funny, don't he? Well, believe me, the day will come when he'll wear out the knees of his pants begging for some of my stuff. Just wait. Now, if you don't think Jeff was justified in howling like that, read this. My dear Sweeney, your enclosed 100 sheets of paper would have been very acceptable to this magazine, had you left them blank. Yours, etc., Hilary Felix, Editor. On the level. Wouldn't that take the heart out of the Sphinx? How the editor ever muffed the mender of broken hearts is to Jeff the 8th, 9th, and 10th wonder of the world. I say, Jeff, maybe if you read a little more, you'd get what they call style. You know that you don't read much besides the Clevelado Evening Guesser, I told Jeff, trying to help him. Forget it, Jim, forget it. You don't have to know anything to write stories. Why, there isn't one story out of 100 that's printed the way the guy wrote it. That's what an editor's for. And talk about reading. Believe me, Jim, nothing gets by me. Absolutely nothing. Why, I've read all the classics, such as Slick Starter, Old Queen Grady, The Statue Boys of '76, and a bunch of them workin' lose tales. Of course, when I was a young chap and didn't know any better, I used to read lowbrow stuff like Less Misery by that Frenchy fellow, Victor Hugo. I also skimmed over a lot of stuff by those old Greek hack writers like Eris Plato, Cicero, and periodicals. Of course, all that stuff died long ago. Take $20,000 Under the Ocean by Julius Verne, for example. Why, in order to keep that alive, they had to put it out as a moving picture. And say, talk about poetry. Remember that small-time poem by old Jack Milton called Paradise Missing? And that infernal affair by Dante on Theory? Well, I read all that dope before I ever met you, Jim. Now doesn't that prove to you that there's something wrong with a country that allows a genius like Jeff to wear out his young life in a suit of overalls? Although I knew he was pretty well educated and all that, I didn't know that he had waded through all that stuff. By the way, Jeff, when did you leave school? I asked. I didn't leave, Jim. You see, it was this way. I had been going to school for about 2 years when one day the goop that sat next to me dropped his bean shooter on the floor. Well, I swiped the blame thing and decided to practice on the kid sitting directly in front of the teacher. Now, I never was a good shot with a thing like that, so I muffed the kid, and the paper bullet hit the teacher plumb on the nose. I haven't been to school since, Jeff concluded with a faraway look in his eyes. Too bad, I remarked, and it sure was. Poor Jeff was one of those fellows who'd never have any luck anyway. 3 days later he bought 7 of the latest magazines and promptly voiced his disapproval of the bunch. However, when I looked them over, I discovered something that might interest him. Say, Jeff, did you notice that chap, Chauncey Crackers, has one of his stories in all these magazines except the Tenderfoot Weekly? What did you say the goop's name was? Asked he, interested. Crackers, I repeated. Crackers? No wonder the girls eat up his brand of stuff. If I had a name like Crackers, I'd write advertisements for the Leatherine Biscuit Company. Listen, Jim, I've got an idea. Suppose I frame up a story and sign Chauncey Crackers' name to it and shoot it to the editor of the Tenderfoot. I figure that the poor dub will faint from joy when he discovers that Chauncey has lowered himself to send him some of his work. How about it? Great, Jeff, great, I exclaimed enthusiastically. Leave it to Sweeney to frame up the big idea. On the level, isn't he some genius? So far as nerve is concerned, Jeff was still about 10 laps ahead of the Kaiser. During the next few days, he wrote the greatest yarn of his career. 3. Say, Jim, I think we better blow from this camp. That Flossie Hemp dame gets me nervous. Did you hear her chatter at the table tonight? She sounded like one of those new squeak-a-lot talking machines. And there I was trying to scheme up a new plot with that chick tittering like a canary bird. Why, she knocked 20 pounds of good thoughts plumb out of my noodle. She was all right until she got that job with the Fluker department store. But since then I guess she hollers, "Cash!" in her sleep. It's fierce. Anyway, he went on, I'm getting sick of the grub old lady Snickers is passing out lately. Did you taste that hash? Some mystery, take it from me. I'll bet 10 to 1 that the cat passed it up. I don't mind hooverizing to help win the war, but old Snickers is just a little too patriotic to suit me. What does she take us for? Birds? And say, don't that pickle supply of hers ever run out? I bet if you walked into the dining room at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'd find a gang of pickles on the table. She must be Heinz's 57th cousin. If she thinks I'm going to slip her 6 bones a week for stuff like that, she's plumb nutty. Remember the breakfast? Why, there was enough water in the oatmeal to make a good-sized fish feel at home. And listen, did you taste that egg that she passed out? I don't want to knock her or anything like that, but I bet the hen that manufactured that egg of mine died 2 years ago. Take it from me, Jim. I'm through. When it came to criticizing Mrs. Snicker's war-portioned meals, Jeff hit the nail right on the bean. The only time the dear old dame paid any attention to her victims was when they failed to hand her the weekly bankroll. In that event, she would rap gently on the door and converse about the weather until you slipped her the coin. Jeff claims that she makes at least 90% on her original investment. After growling a while longer, Jeff settled on the bed in disgust and placed his feet upon the pillow. "Cheer up, Jeff," I said, trying to make him feel better. "Just finish your new cracker story, and you'll feel great when the coin rolls in." "Cheer up, beans," he raved. "How can a guy write in a joint like this?" Jeff was surely developing a temperament, just like those regular writers. "What's the name of the new story?" I inquired, trying to get him separated from his grouch. He brightened up at once and replied, "I named it The End of Tilly Finish, and it's got a laugh in every line. I'll wind it up just as soon as I can forget about that hash." However, Jeff didn't forget about that hash, because the following day at the crocometer factory he had a grand smash-up with the superintendent and was promptly fired. But maybe Jeff didn't tell that fellow something on his way out. Oh boy, when Jeff had finished, the boss looked like nothing ever seen before. Jeff told me about it the same evening. "Take it from me, Jim, I'm glad I'm out of it. How can a man like me get along with a bunch of roughnecks that don't know anything about literature? Why, they're so far out of my class they can't even see me when I breeze by. They never heard of guys like Shakespeare and Rudyard Doyle, or any of those fellows. Well, I don't care. I've got enough coin to hold out a month, and I'm going to sit down and write my head off." "That's the spirit, Jeff. Even if your coin does run out, I'm still working, you know." "I won't forget that, Jim, and when I do get there, you'll be the only guy I'll recognize, believe me." I couldn't help liking Jeff Sweeney. Personally, I wouldn't care if he failed to work for a year. I felt quite sure that it would be only a short time when he would have all the editors winded from chasing after him. Somehow, though, he didn't make a hit with the girls. In fact, Flossie Hemp thought he had some kind of dyspepsia, but I guess she was sore because Jeff didn't fall for her line of beauty. He wasn't a woman-hater or anything like that, but he liked to surround himself with intellectual people. Of course, poor Flossie wasn't guilty of being anything like that. Her vocabulary, consisting of cash, anything else, and thank you, was about all that her brain could handle at the time, but she knew more about chewing gum than the chap that invented it. 4. During the next week, Jeff kept himself cooped in the room like a regular hermit. Although he knew all there was to know about the art of story writing, he bought a book entitled How to Write a Short Story, or Scientific Ways of Ducking an Editor's Wastebasket, just to see if the author of the book knew as much about it as he did. According to Sweeney, the author knew 50% less. "How's the book, Jeff?" I inquired. "Fierce," was his terse reply. "The guy that wrote it, Pendennis Hoop, must have got his dope from an iron foundry. It gets me sore when I read stuff like that. The funny part of it is that he never succeeded in having one of his own stories published. Yet he has the nerve to tell other guys just how to do it. Can you imagine that? For example, take Chapter 10 on What Editors Want But Don't Get. Why, if a writer followed those instructions, he'd be placed in the madhouse for safety of the general public. I bet Pendennis is laughing yet over the 2 bones I slipped him. It's a 10-to-1 shot that he's got a picture of Barnum hanging on the wall." It's a wise old bird that can put one over on Jeff Sweeney, I'll tell you. "Say, Jeff, how's the new cracker story getting along?" "I finished it this morning, Jim, and mailed it to the tenderfoot editor. Before I sent it, I tried it out on Flossie, and what do you suppose happened? Why, the poor female started to cry before she hurdled the 3rd chapter. And I thought I wrote the greatest humorous story on earth. I bet every time she goes to see one of those Charlie Feet comic pictures, she takes along 5 or 6 handkerchiefs to mop up the tears. She's a mystery to me." 5. Now it so happened that the 7th day following the mailing of the Crackers story fell on Friday the 13th, but it didn't fall half as hard as Sweeney. As I entered the house, Mrs. Snickers met me in the hall and nervously informed me that she thought there was something the matter with Jeff, because she heard strange mutterings leaking via the keyhole. Flossie Hemp was quite sure that Mr. Sweeney must have broken the statue of Julius Caesar, as she was very positive that she heard an awful crash that sounded just like pieces of plaster kissing the floor. That was enough to convince me that all was not as it should be up the vicinity of Jefferson Sweeney. I dashed up to the camp and found Jeff pacing up and down the room with his hands behind his back and his hair twisted all over his head. "What's the trouble, Jeff, old boy?" I asked anxiously. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I feel just as lively as Chris Columbus. Get out your guitar, Jim, and play me the Dead March in Saul. Turn the whole world upside down and find out what's on the bottom of it. Go the limit." "But, Jeff, what's the matter?" I pleaded, greatly agitated. "Smatter? Take a slant at the glad news on the table." I walked over to the table and beheld the rejected Crackers story, also a letter from the editor of the Tenderfoot Weekly. When I had finished reading that funereal epistle, I felt worse about it, I think, than Jeff did. Here it is, word for word, and gloom for gloom. "Dear whoever you are, I have reported your case to Dr. Slicer of Morgueview Hospital, and he promises to look you up some day this week. In the meantime, I would suggest that you do the best to alleviate your malady by placing ice-cold towels on your head at intervals of 5 minutes. That's what you get for quitting the plumbing business, anyway. Did a pipe or something fall on your head lately? Sincerely yours, Rufus Hector, Editor, otherwise known as Chauncey Crackers. If, reader, during your travels you chance to find yourself in the little town of Why Not, Delahampshire, step into the City Hall, and you will find the following record. Jefferson Sweeney, born January 13, Friday, 1896, son of Martha and Jerry Sweeney. End of. Nearly over. Words and Music by Thomas Thursday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Braymiller. Words and Music by Thomas Thursday. Chapter 1. Temporarily Unemployed. Take it from me, Jim, there must be something the matter with those songwriting fellows. Why, I bet I could write better songs than they do with my left hand, or even blindfolded in the dark. I pity anybody who's got to sing stuff like that. Of course I'm not knocking, but it's a cinch that they must compose their melodies on a dishpan instead of a piano. I bought a copy of that theatrical magazine called Maudlin Melodia, and believe me, when I read the advertisements of the latest songs, I promptly decided that the song business would go into the hands of the receiver unless I get busy and help them out. On the level, Jim, don't you think I could beat those guys writing songs? Surely, Jeff. Why don't you try? I chirped. I felt certain that my pal and furnished roommate could excel those regular writers, and I was willing to do everything possible to encourage him. Leave it to Jefferson Sweeney to show people the right way to do things. Although the fact that we resided in Mrs. Snicker's boarding house was a severe handicap to Jeff's art, I figured that he would be able to hurdle such minor obstacles with ease. Jeff was temporarily unemployed, but I was perfectly willing to pay his expenses and take general care of him until his volcanic genius erupted into a lava of dividends. The rent extracted by Mrs. Snickers was quite meager, likewise the portions she slipped us at the table. And since my salary had been raised to a higher altitude at the Cricklemeter factory, I was able to defray both our board bills with comparatively small hardship. Anyway, I believed Jeff to be an excellent investment, and that for every $1 I loaned to him, I would receive 10 or more in return. Although my motive was not of a mercenary nature, Jeff insisted that he would pay me back with compound interest just as soon as the literary world awakened to the fact that he was a veritable scribe. Hitherto he had tried his hand at writing stories for the magazines, with considerable success, so much so that he had succeeded in having 2 of his gems accepted by periodicals so large and prominent that one even claimed a circulation of more than 2,000. The mere fact that he had numerous rejections to his credit was not his fault, but rather another demonstration of the gentry who have a stranglehold on the editorial jobs when they ought to have a toehold in the plumbing business. Jeff says so, and, of course, he ought to know. All of which shows that Jeff's batting average in the literary league was not so bad, especially when you take into consideration the editorial southpaws he was obliged to face. "Listen, Jim," continued Jeff, "on your way home from work tomorrow, stop in at Duster's bookstore and get me a copy of How to Write a Popular Song, or Making a Fortune Without Brains, by Fuller Scales. I seen it advertised in the magazines, and maybe it will help me with my work. But I guess I know all there is to know about songwriting. You don't have to know much, anyway." "How much will the book cost, Jeff?" $1.10 net, according to the advertisement. "What does net mean, Jeff?" I asked. "Well, Jim, a net is something they use to catch things in, like fish. But I think it's a little raw when they use it to sell books with, though I admit that I've been caught a good many times myself." Jeff yawned and suggested that we retire for the night, as it was nearing 10 o'clock. Chapter 2. Inspiration and Casey. About 10 minutes after I slid under the sheets, I fell into a much-needed sleep, which was accompanied by a terrible dream. I heard the constant crack of machine guns and numerous rifle shots. Crack, 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 just like that. Then I heard an awful shouting, and awoke to find Jeff pounding away at his typewriter dressed in his pajamas. "What are you shouting about, Jim?" he asked, grinning. "Dreaming?" "What are you trying to do, Jeff? Write songs at 3 a.m.? "Well, I got a corking idea for a song while I was half asleep, and I thought it would be a good idea to reel it off while it was still fresh in my mind. Did I wake you up?" "I should say you did. I thought that I was somewhere in Flanders hearing machine guns spout, caused by you banging on the typewriter, I guess. I sure was scared." And I was. "Sorry, Jim, but wait until you see the song I just wrote. It's a peacherino, believe me." "What's the title?" I asked drowsily. "It's pretty sad, Jim. I've called it When Pitcher McCarthy Hit Casey on the Bean. Take a slant at it and compare it with the stuff you hear nowadays." Jeff passed me his handiwork. "Here's the chorus. Wanger smashed a single to the right field fence, but the way he stole second was more than immense. Speeder hit a scorcher that knocked Hookus on his ear. You can take it from me, but that crowd did cheer. Then Muffin slams the pill way up near the moon. They didn't find the ball till the next afternoon. We needed only another run to even up the score, and the mob went wild till their voices got sore. The next 3 men got their base on balls, which made Manager Flipper foam like Niagara Falls. Then Casey strolled to the plate with his bat in his hand, which made all the girls exclaim, 'Say, ain't he grand?' But such a riot of joy ne'er before was seen, when Pitcher McCarthy hit Casey on the bean." "What do you think of it, Jim?" "Pretty good for 3 o'clock in the morning." "But what happened when Mr. Casey was hit by Mr. McCarthy?" I inquired, not able to understand the song's climax. "What do you suppose happens, you poor goop?" snapped Jeff, getting red in the face. "Would you like me to give you a demonstration? Do you mean to tell me that you don't know what happens when a fellow gets cracked on the bean with a baseball? You wouldn't expect him to sing, would you? As far as I know, Jim, he either gets a place on first base or a place in the hospital. Take it from me, if all the people were like you, I'd have to have my songs illustrated." Chapter 3. Tapping Out Harmony. The following evening, as soon as we had finished our meager supply of hash, onions, and near coffee, Jeff asked Flossie Hemp, the star borderess, if she would assist him to compose a melody to his song. He painted in bright colors the great chance she would have to become rich and famous via the songwriting route. Now, Jeff didn't know one note from the other, so he figured that Flossie would be able to show him a thing or two about extracting harmony from a piano. She was the only person in the house who could get any sound out of Mrs. Snicker's antique instrument, and, needless to say, she was delighted to help Jeff as much as possible. "You see, Miss Hemp," explained Jeff, All you've got to do is tap out a little harmony to the words I've written, and I'll get some goop that knows something about arranging songs to do the rest. If I sell the song, which I surely will, I'll split 50-50 with you. Of course, I can't let you have your name on it, but if it's a hit, I'll mention your name to the actresses and actors, telling them that you helped me out. Are you satisfied?" "I don't care about a name, Mr. Sweeney. All I want is the coin. I saw a gorgeous new—" "That's the idea," interrupted Jeff. "You're just like that old Turkish songwriter, Omar Khayyam, who said, 'Take the cash and let the credit blow.' You remember reading that, don't you?" "Can't say as I did," replied Flossie. This didn't surprise me at all, because when a girl has to measure out ribbons all day at Flooker's department store, she hasn't got any time to delve into the squeaks of songwriters, Turkish or otherwise. Flossie started out by doing a do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. "Hit that do key harder, Miss Hemp," said Jeff. "It sounds like money." After practicing and guessing for about 2 hours, they succeeded in setting a certain amount of notes to "When Pitcher McCarthy Hit Casey on the Bean." Although Jeff's voice would have been more at home selling fish up an alley, he managed to get within 20 yards or so of Flossie's notes. "This piano must have been used by Pocahontas," he complained. "It doesn't seem to harmonize with my voice at all." "Well, my old music teacher, Professor Rumble, always said that you can't get harmony out of oatmeal," tee-heed Flossie, taking a slant at Mrs. Snickers. "I wish you'd whistle instead of trying to sing, Mr. Sweeney," chirped Mrs. Snickers from the corner of the room where she was trying to extract a few tears from the latest sob book. "I can't read with such a racket. If you don't know how to whistle, hum. And I wish Miss Hemp wouldn't strike the keys so hard. I'm afraid she'll put the piano out of tune." "No chance of doing that," answered Jeff. "Paderewski's grandfather did that long ago." "I'll have you understand, Mr. Sweeney," snapped the landlady, "that my piano is in perfect condition. Besides, I didn't agree to furnish a piano with room and board." "That's all right, Mrs. Snickers," retorted Jeff. "If you can prove that Miss Hemp has broken anything that isn't already smashed, I'll pay for it." "You said it," whispered Flossie. And so it went until the song was finally wedded to Flossie's best melodies, after which we dashed up to the camp. Chapter 4. Genius is Genius. "The old lady ought to put that piano in a glass case and hire a watchman," growled Jeff as soon as we landed in the room. "Can you imagine her kicking about anybody putting it out of tune? Why, if that thing could talk, I bet it would tell you all about the Battle of Yorktown." "Never mind, Jeff," I said soothingly. "You'll be able to buy a piano for yourself pretty soon." As Jeff disrobed for the night, he threw one of his shoes at the wall just out of peevishness. "Listen, Jeff," I pleaded. "Please don't get any more inspirations at 3 a.m. I'd like to get a little sleep tonight." "Can't be helped, Jim," he replied, pulling on a sock. "Genius is genius, you know, and it's liable to hit a fellow any time. Why, only the other day I was reading a book called Private Lives of the Old Music Masters, or Why Barbers Went Hungry, by Professor Rufus Halfoff. And believe me, Jim, those fellows used to compose songs at all hours of the day and night. Why, one chap named Harmonio Pepperino used to go without sleep for a week. Another guy, Sirius D. W. Flapdoodle, used to live on 3 soda crackers a day before he became rich and famous. Genius is a wonderful thing, Jim," he concluded, taking a slant at himself in the mirror. "But say, Jeff, why is it that inspiration don't come to a fellow in the daytime?" "I don't know, Jim. Maybe it's bashful or something." However, as I extinguished the light, I hoped that nothing would cause Jeff to leave the bed until morning. Chapter 5. Undoubtedly the Right Place. The following Sunday, Jeff and I decided to search around the neighborhood for somebody who knew something about music. "What will they soak me to arrange my song, do you know, Jim?" "No idea, Jeff. A couple of dollars ought to pay the bill." At 1861 Civil Avenue, we spied a sign reading, "Professor Tra-la-lar-bang, music teacher." "Let's try him," Jeff suggested, leading the way up the stoop. An exceptionally pretty girl answered the bell, all of which made Jeff certain that the place was just what he was looking for. "Is the professor in?" asked Jeff, taking off his hat. "Oh, yes, just step into the conservatory, and I'll inform Father that you have called," she replied, giving Jeff a charming smile. "I guess this is the right place, all right," he whispered as soon as the young lady departed. And when Jeff makes a remark like that about a lady, why, said lady must be a considerable looker, because if there ever was a misogynist, Jeff was it. The professor turned out to be a short, heavy-set man of middle age, with just enough hair on his head to keep about 3 teeth of a comb in active service. "I think your song is marvelous," he told Jeff after trying Flossie's notes on the piano. "Thanks," returned Jeff, flushed. "How much will you charge to arrange it?" "Well, now, considering the fact that you are not a wealthy man, I should think that $10 would be a fair price." The professor turned an innocent-looking face upon Jeff and ran his fingers through at least 3 of his half-a-dozen hairs. Jeff gasped. Ditto yours truly. "What will we do about it, Jim?" he asked, scratching his ear. "Let the professor go ahead and arrange it," I replied, figuring that if the song turned out to be a hit, a little thing like 10 bones would be a mere nothing. "All right, Professor, go to it," said Jeff. "When will it be finished?" "I'll complete it by tomorrow night, and have my daughter deliver it to you," replied the professor as he led us to the door. As soon as we arrived home, Jeff got busy with his typewriter and started to hatch out some more song lyrics. I interrupted several times to ask how he was getting along, but for a reply he placed his finger to his lips, which meant that he was in deep concentration. Chapter 6. A Postponed Order. It is with a heavy heart that I record this chapter in the life of Jefferson Sweeney. Although he finds consolation in the fact that great masters of literature like Rupert Blues, Governor Saab, and John Hendrick Byng had their ups and downs before buying villas on the Hudson. I refused to be cheered by the successes of less talented scribes than Jeff. However, he now admits that he made a slight mistake in supposing that all publishers were capable of recognizing genius as soon as it poked its head above the horizon of a mediocre world. It had cost him $10, of my money, to have Professor Bang arrange the song, and when it drifted back after 2 weeks from the first publisher to which he sent it, Jeff was as peeved as a hungry elephant after muffing a misdirected peanut. And when he had read the letter that accompanied its rejection, he dashed around the room like a Kansas cyclone out upon a practice spin. Here's the letter. Dear Mr. Sweeney, whatever the enclosed is supposed to be, we thank you for submitting the same. We publish songs, not riddles. It may interest you to learn that the 2 basic principles of popular songs are as follows. First, words. Second, music. Since your effort lacks both those essential features, we are obliged to return it to you. Very truly, Bow Fiddle and String, by Delancey Guff. Rather sarcastic. Anent this affair, Jeff commented as follows. Believe me, Jim, those fellows must have glass eyes and wooden heads. Why, they don't know song hits when they see them. I'll leave it to anybody with a spoonful of brains to judge whether or not my stuff isn't far ahead of those regular writers. Flossie, of course, was heartbroken over the whole business. She had left a deposit on a new gown at Madame de Murphy's Maison Parisienne, with full expectations of paying the balance from the proceeds of the songs. However, as soon as Flossie was apprised of the sad news, she immediately asked Madame to hold the gown for a few days more. Chapter 7. A Brilliant Plan. Listen, Jim, Jeff said later in a calmer manner. I've decided to change my name. Maybe they think that a fellow with a name like mine can't write songs. Do names count, Jeff? I inquired, wondering if it was so. I should say they do. That's why I'm going to take one of those hide-and-seek names myself. Just look at the fancy names on the songs and novels. To make sure that he would adopt a fitting name, Jeff delved into a volume entitled Aristocrats of the Old World, or Who Used to Be Who, by Baron Deliverus Lightnob. Due to the fact that he found such a vast assortment of noble-sounding names, he cogitated long and ponderously before making a selection. I guess Algernon St. Cyr just about fits my talent, he decided, throwing the book upon the bureau. Sounds rather elite and distinctive, I affirmed, and it surely did. Jeff sent out the song again, this time to the Jazzerino Music Company, and the name of the author and composer was not Jefferson Sweeney now, but Algernon St. Cyr. But the title remained the same, when Pitcher McCarthy hit Casey on the bean. Chapter 8. Prunes on the Side. A week passed, during which time Jeff gave his brain a much-needed rest by staying as far away from the camp as possible. He would tramp the streets for hours at a time with a notebook in hand, jotting down anything that impressed him as being good song material. He had visions of Ava Tangleway, Grace Ledoux, and Harry Lauder singing his song gem before great and enthusiastic audiences. Flossie, in turn, cared nothing for fame and less for the applause of the multitudes. But that gown, would Madame de Murphy wait just a little longer? She would. Flossie's anxiety was caused more or less by the rapidly approaching ball to be given by the Big Noise Social Club, of which she was an honorary member. And maybe she wouldn't make Tilly giggle jealous when that glove-counter expert piped her new regalia. Well. And then, a few days more of anxious waiting, a little more anticipation, and the world was theirs. The sun shone, the birds sang, and the moon beamed, just for Flossie and Jeff. Soon as I had arrived home from work, accompanied by a certain amount of grease and grime, I was apprised of the glad news. The song was bought and paid for. Not a word was enclosed with the $50 check. Just pay to the order of Algernon St. Cyr, etc. Letters don't count, Jim, Jeff informed me. Although the price paid for my song is pretty low, it's all right for a starter. Anyway, it proves that there is at least one publisher in the country with brains enough to appreciate a song hit when he sees it. As soon as Mrs. Snickers had cashed the check, Jeff gave Flossie her share, and that young lady immediately dashed out and brought back the cherished gown, much to the admiration of the landlady. "Ain't it just gorgeous?" she asked the assembled company, displaying her heart's desire. "It looks great, Miss Hemp, great," chirped Jeff. "Stick to me and you'll soon be owning motors and yachts." Much joy in the house that night. The landlady even went so far as to give us an extra portion of prunes and enough butter to cover sufficiently at least 3 slices of bread. Jeff was obliged to admit that she could be human if she tried. That night Jeff slept as calmly as Rip Van Winkle was supposed to have slept. Not a murmur, not a twist, not a sign of restlessness was noticeable during the entire slumber period. Chapter 9. Business Skill. The following morning a slight tap on the door was accompanied by a letter that Mrs. Snickers slipped under the crack. Jeff was the first to read it, and then, bang, like a bolt from the sky, his hopes and dreams were dashed to oblivion. Luck, apparently, was not twin to genius, or even a distant relation. Here's the letter. Mr. Algernon St. Cyr, 13 Luck Avenue, Clevelado, Calachusetts. Dear Sir, recently we sent you our check for $50. In doing this, our bookkeeper, in a manner that is still puzzling us, made a grievous mistake. Check should have been sent to another person. Be kind enough to rectify his error by returning the aforementioned sum as soon as convenient. Your song is under consideration. Yours truly, Jazzerino Music Company, by Octavio Flatt. Well, maybe Jeff wasn't peeved. Boy! He ran his fingers through his own wealth of red hair in a manner that betokened no great love for a certain music publisher. "Believe me, Jim, this world is all wrong," he complained. "How does that goop expect me to return money that I already spent? Can they have me arrested?" he suddenly asked, his face turning from a red to a whitish hue. "I don't know, Jeff," I replied, not knowing anything about the law on that point. Jeff, for the next few minutes, paced around the room like a caged wild cat, and then, getting a sudden inspiration, exclaimed, "I'm going to take a chance, Jim. I'll teach those birds a lesson. Take it from me." He dashed over to the typewriter and yanked off the cover. His face regaining its fiery color, Jeff proceeded to assault that innocent piece of mechanism in an extremely vicious manner. He walloped the commas, banged the semicolons, and pounded the periods. "Take a slant at this, Jim," he said, passing me the following letter. Mr. Octavio Flatt, care of Jazzerino Music Company, Bedlam, Orifornia. My dear Mr. Flatt, you said it. Take it from me, mistake is the correct word. If you can show me how to return money that I've already spent, you might have a chance of getting back your coin. Hereafter, count your change before leaving the post-box, and give my regards to the bookkeeper. He's my idea of a regular guy. And listen, since my song is paid for, why not publish it? Yours seriously, Algernon St. Cyr. Believe me, Jim, they've got to publish my song now. And Algernon St. Cyr, nay, Jefferson Sweeney, smiled triumphantly. He considered himself a businessman as well as a genius, a bird that does not occur in many regions. End of Words and Music.
A Passion in the Desert by Honoré de Balzac. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Winston, Tharp. "The sight was fearful," she exclaimed as we left the menagerie of Monsieur Martin. She had been watching that daring speculator as he went through his wonderful performance in the den of the hyena. "How is it possible," she continued, "to tame those animals so as to be certain that he can trust them?" "You think it is a problem," I answered, interrupting her, "and yet it is a natural fact." "Oh," she cried, an incredulous smile flickering on her lip. "Do you think that beasts are devoid of passions?" I asked. "Let me assure you that we teach them all the vices and virtues of our own state of civilization." She looked at me in amazement. "The first time I saw Monsieur Martin," I added, "I exclaimed, as you do, with surprise. I happened to be sitting beside an old soldier whose right leg was amputated, and whose appearance had attracted my notice as I entered the building. His face, stamped with the scars of battle, wore the undaunted look of a veteran of the wars of Napoleon. Moreover, the old hero had a frank and joyous manner which attracts me whenever I meet it. He was doubtless one of those old campaigners whom nothing can surprise, who find something to laugh at in the last contortions of a comrade, and will bury a friend or rifle his body gaily, challenging bullets with indifference, making short shrift for themselves or others, and fraternizing, as a usual thing, with the devil. After looking very attentively at the proprietor of the menagerie as he entered the den, my companion curled his lip with that expression of satirical contempt which well-informed men sometimes put on to mark the difference between themselves and dupes. As I uttered my exclamation of surprise at the coolness and courage of Monsieur Martin, the old soldier smiled, shook his head, and said with a knowing glance, "An old story." "How do you mean, an old story?" I asked. "If you could explain the secret of this mysterious power, I should be greatly obliged to you." After a while, during which we became better acquainted, we went to dine at the first café we could find after leaving the menagerie. A bottle of champagne with our dessert brightened the old man's recollections and made them singularly vivid. He related to me a circumstance in his early history which proved that he had ample cause to pronounce Monsieur Martin's performance an old story. When we reached her house, she was so persuasive and captivating, and made me so many pretty promises, that I consented to write down for her benefit the story told me by the old hero. On the following day I sent her this episode of a historical epic which might be entitled The French in Egypt. At the time of General Desaix's expedition to Upper Egypt, a Provençal soldier who had fallen into the hands of the Maghrebins was marched by those tireless Arabs across the desert which lies beyond the cataracts of the Nile. To put sufficient distance between themselves and the French army, the Maghrebins made a forced march and did not halt until after nightfall. They then camped around a well shaded with palm trees, near which they had previously buried a stock of provisions. Not dreaming that the thought of escape could enter their captive's mind, they merely bound his wrists and lay down to sleep themselves after eating a few dates and giving their horses a feed of barley. When the bold Provençal saw his enemies too soundly asleep to watch him, he used his teeth to pick up a scimitar, with which, steadying the blade by means of his knees, he contrived to cut through the cord which bound his hands, and thus recovered his liberty. He at once seized a carbine and a poniard, took the precaution to lay in a supply of dates, a small bag of barley, some powder and ball, buckled on the scimitar, mounted one of the horses, and spurred him in the direction where he supposed the French army to be. Impatient to meet the outposts, he pressed the horse, which was already wearied, so severely that the poor animal fell dead with his flanks torn, leaving the Frenchman alone in the midst of the desert. After marching for a long time through the sand with the dogged courage of an escaping galley slave, the soldier was forced to halt as darkness drew on, for his utter weariness compelled him to rest, though the exquisite sky of an eastern night might have tempted him to continue the journey. Happily he had reached a slight elevation, at the top of which a few palm trees shot upward, whose leafage, seen from a long distance against the sky, had helped to sustain his hopes. His fatigue was so great that he threw himself down on a block of granite, cut by nature into the shape of a camp bed, and slept heavily, without taking the least precaution to protect himself while asleep. He accepted the loss of his life as inevitable, and his last waking thought was one of regret for having left the Mugravins, whose no-bad life began to charm him now that he was far away from them and from every other hope of succor. He was awakened by the sun, whose pitiless beams, falling vertically upon the granite rock, produced an intolerable heat. The Provençal had ignorantly flung himself down in a contrary direction to the shadows thrown by the verdant and majestic fronds of the palm trees. He gazed at these solitary monarchs and shuddered. They recalled to his mind the graceful shafts crowned with long weaving leaves which distinguished the Saracenic columns of the Cathedral of Arles. The thought overcame him, and when, after counting the trees, he threw his eyes upon the scene around him, an agony of despair convulsed his soul. He saw a limitless ocean. The sombre sands of the desert stretched out till lost to sight in all directions. They glittered with dark luster like a steel blade shining in the sun. He could not tell if it were an ocean or a chain of lakes that lay mirrored before him. A hot vapor swept in waves above the surface of this heaving continent. The sky had the oriental glow of translucent purity, which disappoints because it leaves nothing for the imagination to desire. The heavens and the earth were both on fire. Silence added its awful and desolate majesty. Infinitude, immensity pressed down upon the soul on every side, not a cloud in the sky, not a breath in the air, not a rift on the breast of the sand, which was ruffled only with little ridges scarcely rising above its surface. Far as the eye could reach, the horizon fell away into space, marked by a slender line, slim as the edge of a saber, like as in summer seas a thread of light parts this earth from the heaven it meets. The Provençal clasped the trunk of a palm tree as if it were the body of a friend. Sheltered from the sun by its straight and slender shadow, he wept, and presently, sitting down, he remained motionless, contemplating with awful dread the implacable nature stretched out before him. He cried aloud, as if to tempt the solitude to answer him. His voice, lost in the hollows of the hillock, sounded afar with a thin resonance that returned no echo. The echo came from the soldier's heart. He was 22 years old, and he loaded his carbine. "Time enough," he muttered, as he put the liberating weapon on the sand beside him. Gazing by turns at the burnished blackness of the sand and the blue expanse of the sky, the soldier dreamed of France. He smelt and fancied the gutters of Paris. He remembered the towns through which he had passed, the faces of his comrades, and the most trifling incidents of his life. His southern imagination saw the pebbles of his own Provence in the undulating play of the heated air as it seemed to roughen the far-reaching surface of the desert. Dreading the dangers of this cruel mirage, he went down the little hill on the side opposite to that by which he had gone up the night before. His joy was great when he discovered a natural grotto formed by the immense blocks of granite which made a foundation for the rising ground. The remnants of a mat showed that this place had once been inhabited, and close to the entrance were a few palm trees loaded with fruit. The instinct which binds men to life woke in his heart. He now hoped to live until some Mughrabin should pass that way. Possibly he might even hear the roar of a cannon, for Bonaparte was at that time overrunning Egypt. Encouraged by these thoughts, the Frenchman shook down a cluster of the ripe fruit under the weight of which the palms were bending, and as he tasted this unhoped-for manna, he thanked the former inhabitant of the grotto for the cultivation of the trees, which the rich and luscious flesh of the fruit amply attested. Like a true Provençal, he passed from the gloom of despair to a joy that was half insane. He ran back to the top of the hill and busied himself for the rest of the day in cutting down one of the sterile trees which had been his shelter the night before. Some vague recollection made him think of the wild beasts of the desert, and foreseeing that they would come to drink at a spring which bubbled through the sand at the foot of the rock, he resolved to protect his hermitage by felling a tree across the entrance. Notwithstanding his eagerness and the strength which the fear of being attacked while asleep gave to his muscles, he was unable to cut the palm tree in pieces during the day, but he succeeded in bringing it down. Towards evening, the king of the desert fell, and the noise of his fall, echoing far, was like a moan from the breast of solitude. The soldier shuddered as though he had heard a voice predicting evil, but like an heir who does not long mourn a parent, he stripped from the beautiful tree the arching green fronds, its poetical adornment, and made a bed of them in his refuge. Then, tired with his work and by the heat of the day, he fell asleep beneath the red vault of the grotto. In the middle of the night his sleep was broken by a strange noise. He sat up. The deep silence that reigned everywhere enabled him to hear the alternating rhythm of a respiration whose savage vigor could not belong to a human being. A terrible fear, increased by the darkness, by the silence, by the rush of his waking fancies, numbed his heart. He felt the contraction of his hair, which rose on end as his eyes, dilating to their full strength, beheld through the darkness 2 faint amber lights. At first he thought them an optical delusion, but by degrees the clearness of the night enabled him to distinguish objects in the grotto, and he saw, within 2 feet of him, an enormous animal lying at rest. Was it a lion? Was it a tiger? Was it a crocodile? The Provençal had not enough education to know in what subspecies he ought to class the intruder, but his terror was all the greater because his ignorance made it vague. He endured the cruel trial of listening, of striving to catch the peculiarities of this breathing without losing one of its inflections, and without daring to make the slightest movement. A strong odor, like that exhaled by foxes, only more pungent and penetrating, filled the grotto. When the soldier had tasted it, so to speak, by the nose, his fear became terror. He could no longer doubt the nature of this terrible companion whose royal lair he had taken for a bivouac. Before long, the reflection of the moon, as it sank to the horizon, lighted up the den and gleamed upon the shining, spotted skin of a panther. The Lion of Egypt lay asleep, curled up like a dog, the peaceable possessor of a kennel at the gate of a mansion. Its eyes, which had opened for a moment, were now closed. Its head was turned toward the Frenchman. 100 conflicting thoughts rushed through the mind of the panther's prisoner. Should he kill it with a shot from his musket? But ere the thought was formed, he saw there was no room to take aim. His muzzle would have gone beyond the animal. Suppose he were to wake it? The fear kept him motionless. As he heard the beating of his heart through the dead silence, he cursed the strong pulsations of his vigorous blood, lest they should disturb the sleep which gave him time to think and plan for safety. Twice he put his hand on his scimitar, with the idea of striking off the head of his enemy. But the difficulty of cutting through the close-haired skin made him renounce the bold attempt. Suppose he missed his aim? It would, he knew, be certain death. He preferred the chance of a struggle, and resolved to wait the dawn. It was not long in coming. As daylight broke, the Frenchman was able to examine the animal. Its muzzle was stained with blood. "It has eaten a good meal," thought he. Not caring whether the feast were human flesh or not, it will not be hungry when it wakes. It was a female. The fur on the belly and on the thighs was of sparkling whiteness. Several little spots like velvet made pretty bracelets round her paws. The muscular tail was also white, but it terminated with black rings. The fur of the back, yellow as dead gold and very soft and glossy, bore their characteristic spots shaded like a full-blown rose, which distinguished the panther from all other species of felis. This terrible hostess lay tranquilly snoring in an attitude as easy and graceful as that of a cat on the cushions of an ottoman. Her bloody paws, sinewy and well-armed, were stretched beyond her head, which lay upon them, and from her muzzle projected a few straight hairs called whiskers, which shimmered in the early light like silver wires. If he had seen her lying thus imprisoned in a cage, the Provençal would have admired the creature's grace and the strong contrast of vivid color which gave to her robe an imperial splendor. But as it was, his sight was jaundiced by sinister forebodings. The presence of the panther, though she was still asleep, had the same effect upon his mind as the magnetic eyes of a snake produce, we are told, upon the nightingale. The soldier's courage oozed away in presence of this silent peril, though he was a man who gathered nerve before the mouths of cannon belching grape-shot. And yet, ere long, a bold thought entered his mind, and checked the cold sweat which was rolling from his brow. Roused to action, as some men are when driven face to face with death, they defy it and offer themselves to their doom. He saw a tragedy before him, and he resolved to play his part with honor to the last. "Yesterday," he said, "the Arabs might have killed me." Regarding himself as dead, he waited bravely, but with anxious curiosity for the waking of his enemy. When the sun rose, the panther suddenly opened her eyes. Then she stretched her paws violently, as if to unlimber them from the cramp of their position. Presently she yawned and showed the frightful armament of her teeth, and her cloven tongue rough as a grater. "She is like a dainty woman," thought the Frenchman, watching her as she rolled and turned on her side with an easy and coquettish movement. She licked the blood from her paws and rubbed her head with a reiterated movement full of grace. "Well done! Dress yourself prettily, my little woman," said the Frenchman, who recovered his gaiety as soon as he had recovered his courage. "We are going to bid each other good morning." And he felt for the short poniard which he had taken from the Maghrébins. At this instant the panther turned her head towards the Frenchman and looked at him fixedly, without moving. The rigidity of her metallic eyes and the insupportable clearness made the Provençal shudder. The beast moved towards him. He looked at her caressingly, with a soothing glance by which he hoped to magnetize her. He let her come quite close to him before he stirred. Then, with a touch as gentle and loving as he might have used to a pretty woman, he slid his hand along her spine from the head to the flanks, scratching with his nails the flexible vertebrae which divide the yellow back of a panther. The creature drew up her tail voluptuously, her eyes softened, and when for the third time the Frenchman bestowed this self-interested caress, she gave vent to a purr like that with which a cat expresses pleasure, but it issued from a throat so deep and powerful that the sound echoed through the grotto like the last chords of an organ rolling along the roof of a church. The Provençal, perceiving the value of his caresses, redoubled them until they had completely soothed and lulled the imperious courtesan. When he felt that he had subdued the ferocity of his capricious companion, whose hunger had so fortunately been appeased the night before, he rose to leave the grotto. The panther let him go. But as soon as he reached the top of the little hill, she bounded after him with the lightness of a bird hopping from branch to branch, and rubbed against his legs, arching her back with the gesture of a domestic cat. Then, looking at her guest with an eye that was growing less inflexible, she uttered the savage cry which naturalists liken to the noise of a saw. "My lady is exacting," cried the Frenchman, smiling. He began to play with her ears and stroke her belly, and at last he scratched her head firmly with his nails. Encouraged by success, he tickled her skull with the point of his dagger, looking for the right spot where to stab her, but the hardness of the bone made him pause, dreading failure. The Sultana of the Desert acknowledged the talents of her slave by lifting her head and swaying her neck to his caresses, betraying satisfaction by the tranquillity of her relaxed attitude. The Frenchman suddenly perceived that he could assassinate the fierce princess at a blow if he struck her in the throat, and he had raised the weapon when the panther, surfeited perhaps with his caresses, threw herself gracefully at his feet, glancing up at him with a look in which, despite her natural ferocity, a flicker of kindness could be seen. The poor Provençal, frustrated for the moment, ate his dates as he leaned against a palm tree, casting from time to time an interrogating eye across the desert in the hope of discerning rescue from afar, and then lowering it upon his terrible companion to watch the chances of her uncertain clemency. Each time he threw away a date-stone, the panther eyed the spot where it fell with an expression of keen distrust, and she examined the Frenchman with what might be called a commercial prudence. The examination, however, seemed favorable, for when the man had finished his meager meal, she licked his shoes and wiped off the dust which was caked into the folds of the leather with her rough and powerful tongue. "How will it be when she is hungry?" thought the Provençal. In spite of the shudder which this reflection cost him, his attention was attracted by the symmetrical proportions of the animal, and he began to measure them with his eye. She was 3 feet in height to the shoulder and 4 feet long, not including the tail. That powerful weapon, which was as round as a club, measured 3 feet. The head, as large as that of a lioness, was remarkable for an expression of crafty intelligence. The cold cruelty of a tiger was its ruling trait, and yet it bore a vague resemblance to the face of an artful woman. As the soldier watched her, the countenance of this solitary queen shone with a savage gaiety like that of Nero in his cups. She had slaked her thirst for blood, and now wished for play. The Frenchman tried to come and go, and accustomed her to his movements. The panther left him free, as if contented to follow him with her eyes, seeming, however, less like a faithful dog watching his master's movements with affection than a large Angora cat uneasy and suspicious of them. A few steps brought him to the spring, where he saw the carcass of his horse, which the panther had evidently carried there. Only 2/3 was eaten. The sight reassured the Frenchman, for it explained the absence of his terrible companion and the forbearance which she had shown to him while asleep. This first good luck encouraged the reckless soldier as he thought of the future. The wild idea of making a home with the panther until some chance of escape occurred entered his mind, and he resolved to try every means of taming her and of turning her good will to account. With these thoughts he returned to her side and noticed joyfully that she moved her tail with an almost imperceptible motion. He sat down beside her fearlessly, and they began to play with each other. He held her paws and her muzzle, twisted her ears, threw her over on her back, and stroked her soft, warm flanks. She allowed him to do so, and when he began to smooth the fur of her paws, she carefully drew in her murderous claws, which were sharp and curved like a Damascus blade. The Frenchman kept one hand on his dagger, again watching his opportunity to plunge it into the belly of the too confiding beast, but the fear that she might strangle him in her last convulsions once more stayed his hand. Moreover, he felt in his heart a foreboding of a remorse which warned him not to destroy a hitherto inoffensive creature. He even fancied that he had found a friend in the limitless desert. His mind turned back involuntarily to his first mistress, whom he had named in derision Mignonne, because her jealousy was so furious that throughout the whole period of their intercourse he lived in dread of the knife with which he threatened him. This recollection of his youth suggested the idea of teaching the young panther, whose soft agility and grace he now admired with less terror, to answer to the caressing name. Towards evening he had grown so familiar with his perilous position that he was half in love with its dangers, and his companion was so far tamed that she had caught the habit of turning to him when he called in falsetto tones, "Mignonne." As the sun went down, Mignonne uttered at intervals a prolonged, deep, melancholy cry. "She is well brought up," thought the gay soldier. "She says her prayers." But the jest only came into his mind as he watched the peaceful attitude of his comrade. "Come, my pretty blonde, I will let you go to bed first," he said, relying on the activity of his legs to get away as soon as she fell asleep, and trusting to find some other resting place for the night. He waited anxiously for the right moment, and when it came, he started vigorously in the direction of the Nile. But he had scarcely marched for half an hour through the sand before he heard the panther bounding after him, giving at intervals the saw-like cry which was more terrible to hear than the thud of her bounds. "Well, well," he cried, "she must have fallen in love with me. Perhaps she has never met anyone else. It is flattering to be her first love." So thinking, he fell into one of the treacherous quicksands which deceive the inexperienced traveler in the desert, and from which there is seldom any escape. He felt he was sinking, and he uttered a cry of despair. The panther seized him by the collar with her teeth and sprang vigorously backward, drawing him like magic from the sucking sand. "Ah, mignonne," cried the soldier, kissing her with enthusiasm, "we belong to each other now, for life, for death. But play me no tricks," he added, as he turned back the way he came. From that moment, the desert was, as it were, peopled for him. It held a being to whom he could talk, and whose ferocity was now lulled into gentleness, although he could scarcely explain to himself the reasons for this extraordinary friendship. His anxiety to keep awake and on his guard succumbed to excessive weariness both of body and mind, and throwing himself down on the floor of the grotto, he slept soundly. At his waking, Mignonne was gone. He mounted the little hill to scan the horizon, and perceived her in the far distance, returning with the long bounds peculiar to these animals, who are prevented from running by the extreme flexibility of their spinal column. Mignonne came home with bloody jaws, and received the tribute of caresses which her slave hastened to pay, all the while manifesting her pleasure by reiterated purring. Her eyes, now soft and gentle, rested kindly on the Provençal, who spoke to her lovingly as he would a domestic animal. "Ah, mademoiselle, for you are an honest girl, are you not? You like to be petted, don't you? Are you not ashamed of yourself? You have been eating a Maghrébin. Well, well, they are animals like the rest of you, but you are not to crunch up a Frenchman. Remember that. If you do, I will not love you." She played like a young dog with her master, and let him roll her over and pat and stroke her, and sometimes she would coax him to play by laying a paw upon his knee with a pretty, soliciting gesture. Several days passed rapidly. This strange companionship revealed to the Provençal the sublime beauties of the desert, the alternations of hope and fear, the sufficiency of food, the presence of a creature who occupied his thoughts. All this kept his mind alert, yet free. It was a life full of strange contrasts. Solitude revealed to him her secrets and wrapped him with her charm. In the rising and the setting of the sun he saw splendors unknown to the world of men. He quivered as he listened to the soft whirring of the wings of a bird, rare visitant, or watched the blending of the fleeting clouds, those changeful and many-tinted voyagers. In the waking hours of the night he studied the play of the moon upon the sandy ocean, where the strong simoom had rippled the surface into waves and ever-varying undulations. He lived in the eastern day. He worshipped its marvelous glory. He rejoiced in the grandeur of the storms when they rolled across the vast plain and tossed the sand upward till it looked like a dry red fog or a solid death-dealing vapor. And as the night came on, he welcomed it with ecstasy, grateful for the blessed coolness of the light of the stars. His ears listened to the music of the skies. Solitude taught him the treasures of meditation. He spent hours in recalling trifles and in comparing his past life with the weird present. He grew fondly attached to his panther, for he was a man who needed an affection. Whether it were that his own will, magnetically strong, had modified the nature of his savage princess, or that the wars then raging in the desert had provided her with an ample supply of food, it is certain that she showed no sign of attacking him, and became so tame that he soon felt no fear of her. He spent much of his time in sleeping, though with his mind awake like a spider in its web, lest he should miss some deliverance that might chance to cross the sandy sphere marked out by the horizon. He had made his shirt into a banner and tied it to the top of a palm tree which he had stripped of its leafage. Taking counsel of necessity, he kept the flag extended by fastening the corners with twigs and wedges, for the fitful wind might have failed to wave it at the moment when the longed-for succor came in sight. Nevertheless, there were long hours of gloom when hope forsook him, and then he played with his panther. He learned to know the different inflections of her voice and the meanings of her expressive glance. He studied the variegation of the spots which shaded the dead gold of her robe. Mignon no longer growled when he caught the tuft of her dangerous tail and counted the black and white rings which glittered in the sunlight like a cluster of precious stones. He delighted in the soft lines of her lithe body, the whiteness of her belly, the grace of her charming head. But above all, he loved to watch her as she gamboled at play. The agility and youthfulness of her movements were a constantly fresh surprise to him. He admired the suppleness of the flexible body as she bounded, crept, and glided, or clung to the trunk of palm trees, or rolled over and over, crouching sometimes to the ground, and gathering herself together as she made ready for her vigorous spring. Yet however vigorous the bound, however slippery the granite block on which she landed, she would stop short, motionless, at the one word, "Mignon." One day, under a dazzling sun, a large bird hovered in the sky. The Provençal left his panther to watch the new guest. After a moment's pause, the neglected sultana uttered a low growl. "The devil take me, I believe she is jealous," exclaimed the soldier, observing the rigid look which once more appeared in her metallic eyes. "The soul of Sofronie has gotten into her body." The eagle disappeared in ether, and the Frenchman, recalled by the panther's displeasure, admired afresh her rounded flanks and the perfect grace of her attitude. She was as pretty as a woman, the blonde brightness of her robe shaded with delicate gradations to the dead white tones of her furry thighs. The vivid sunshine brought out the brilliancy of this living gold and its variegated brown spots with indescribable luster. The panther and the Provençal gazed at each other with human comprehension. She trembled with delight, the coquettish creature, as she felt the nails of her friend scratching the strong bones of her skull. Her eyes glittered like flashes of lightning, and then she closed them tightly. "She has a soul," cried the soldier, watching the tranquil repose of this sovereign of the desert, golden as the sands, white as their pulsing light, solitary and burning as they. "Well," she said, "I have read your defense of the beasts, but tell me what was the end of this friendship between two beings so formed to understand each other?" "Ah, exactly," I replied. "It ended as all great passions end, by a misunderstanding. Both sides imagine treachery, pride prevents an explanation, and the rupture comes about through obstinacy." "Yes," she said, "and sometimes a word, a look, an exclamation suffices. But tell me the end of the story." "That is difficult," I answered, "but I will give it to you in the words of the old veteran as he finished the bottle of champagne and exclaimed, 'I don't know how I could have hurt her, but she suddenly turned upon me as if in fury, and seized my thigh with her sharp teeth, and yet, as I afterwards remembered, not cruelly. I thought she meant to devour me, and I plunged my dagger into her throat. She rolled over with a cry that froze my soul. She looked at me in her death struggle, but without anger. I would have given all the world, my cross, which I had not then gained, all, everything, to have brought her back to life. It was as if I had murdered a friend, a human being. When the soldiers who saw my flag came to my rescue, they found me weeping. Monsieur," he resumed after a moment's silence, "I went through the wars in Germany, Spain, Russia, France. I have marched my carcass well-nigh over all the world, but I have seen nothing comparable to the desert. Ah, it is grand, glorious." "What were your feelings there?" I asked. "They cannot be told, young man. Besides, I do not always regret my panther and my palm tree oasis. I must be very sad for that. But I will tell you this. In the desert there is all, and yet nothing." "Stay, explain that." "Well, then," he said with a gesture of impatience. God is there, and man is not. End of A Passion in the Desert by Honoré de Balzac.
A Cowl in Cracow by Minnie Muriel Dowie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ginny. It was while I was in Cracow, spending my days happily and quietly in wanderings whose vagueness I jealously guarded from the narrowing influences of the guidebook. My excursions had been governed by a principle which holds a vast amount of satisfaction for me. Each morning I had sallied forth and walked to the root of some impressive spire which had seemed to call me, and I could never tell the world of old houses and rich pink brickwork that I delighted in as I went. One spire only puzzled me. Twice I had started for it. Each time I had arrived, hot and interested, quite elsewhere. Needless to say, it gathered an imaginary importance, and I marked it down finally with a sporting eye and started to walk it up scientifically, keeping it well to windward, and making use of all available cover. I skirted the somewhat French quarter of the town, and passed through the Jewish colony, and thence away by a road that seemed aiming for the open country, when at length I recognized my spire, caught in a thicket of big trees, from which grew the long sides of a raspberry-colored building of many windows and a pervading silence. Silence has slept in its courtyard and beneath the empty arches of its doorways. Silence browsed with the brown cow in the center of its grass plot. In all the rooms and ways of it, nothing was stirring. And yet it did not seem dead. On the contrary, windows were open, and curtains not a fortnight starched fluttered at its sills. My intrusion, for I intruded quite promptly, excited no attention, unless perhaps the cow noticed me. I surveyed the 2 stories on 3 sides of me, and the tower and the trees, and I could come to no conclusion. If it were a nunnery, which might account for the tower, why had it not the traditional high wall all round it? Why was it open to the little byway and gate through which I had approached? Where was the surly porter who, through a grating, should have kept the world at bay? Now, I do not need anyone to tell me that my next act was inexcusable. I know this, but perhaps it was justified. However, you are to hear and can judge. I walked in at one of those doorways, choosing, for preference, one through which a sunbeam was preceding me, and I set a resolute but reasoning foot upon the stairway. It was thus I reasoned. The worst that could happen to me would be to be turned out, which would not be injurious, and the best that could happen to me would be to discover my whereabouts, and perhaps have an amusing conversation with an inmate. At the best, I could apologize with such wit and grace as the moment vouchsafed me. At the worst, I could but appear a stupid and intrusive foreigner. It was in this philosophic spirit that I ascended 2 flights of stairs and turned with a degree of deprecation along a flagged corridor, but it was not exactly in this spirit that I found myself opposite an open door and regarding a young man shaving himself before a glass, a young man attired in a more surprising costume than I have ever happened to imagine. He did not see me. It was his profile that I was regarding, and my eye traveled from the cheek he was elaborately scraping to the curious cream woolen and cotton dress which clothed him. Then it struck me that he was some kind of a priest or monk. I was in a monastery. It will not hurt me to admit that a thrill, strange to me since, years before, I depleted a store cupboard of some preserved American limes, flickered and prickled in the nape of my neck and down my spine. It was then that the young man put down his razor, and in turning sideways caught sight of my quite motionless figure. I expect monks are a pretty transcendental kind of people, and perhaps a little exalted in their minds. At any rate, that one treated me with the respectful stare one would lavish on a being from another world. Certainly he did not think I was real, and I do not blame him. To me he appeared a creature in a front scene, I one of the audience, of whom nothing but attention was expected. He began speaking in a tremulous, rapid undertone, in Polish, and I, feeling the situation so absurd and so unreal, laughed and begged him, in French, to forgive my invasion. I felt, in a silly sort of way, that my simple person stood for the outside world, and vanity and folly, and perhaps wickedness, and it amused me, and made me wish I knew how to giggle, and could have giggled then. But he wiped the soap from his face with a long, narrow strip of the hardest huckaback toweling I have ever seen, which hung by a tag from the wall, and looked at me, still with a rather dazed face, but conciliatory. "Madam, are you an apparition?" he said gently, and with a smile glimmering through his surprise. I nodded pleasantly. "And how is it that— do you want anything of me?" He had altered his phrase, and this second one had in it a note of eagerness that did not chime in with my ideas of the conventual manner. "Thank you, I do not know that I want anything now," I replied. "I did want to know what this place was, and I came up— Here the feebleness of my case overcame me, and I did not proceed with my explanations. The young man, however, did not seem to notice any flaws in my remarks. He was rather thinking within himself as he reached a white serge garment from a narrow bed and slipped into it mechanically. "I am a stranger. I think I just wanted to be interested," I supplemented. "You are the only stranger that has set foot within this building," he said gravely, "since I came here, a stranger, 15 months ago." "But there is nothing to prevent anybody coming in that I can see," said I, in defense of my presence. "It's all quite open. We are known, the views of our order and its laws in Cracow. No one belonging to this place would pass that first gateway." "Wouldn't they indeed?" said I, much interested. "And why did you come here?" The minute I had said it, I felt this remark to be inquisitive, but I must have appeared so inquisitive altogether that a little more or less could not matter, and the young brother in no way resented the inquiry. "I came here by a trick," he replied with some fierceness, and I leaned back upon the stonework and blinked at him. The oddness of my position struck me far more forcibly than before, and though he was speaking, even asking me questions, it all went by me as though I watched it in a dream, until at last I woke, and he seemed to be telling me about himself. I was intended for the Austrian diplomatic service, he was saying, and was passing through a course at the University of Paris. I had never had great sympathy with my family, and I disliked the Austrian ideas and influence. I am a Pole, and I love my own country. In Paris I met others of the same mind. I became one of them. We had our dreams, and we hoped. I see now that I abused my father's confidence, but my punishment has been bitter. For 10 months I labored secretly, put aside my title, and traveled to Switzerland, to London, lectured and spoke for our cause, and told my family no word of what I was doing. It does not matter, it would not matter if I told you the whole of it now, for I am as dead to the world as if I were in a silver tomb in the vaults of Wawel. But it broke up my life. A lady at whose house I visited in Paris learned something of my pursuits and wrote to my family. I do not say that she meant ill. I was recalled to Vienna to join my father, who has a high position there and is much favored by the emperor. He spoke to me of the ruin of our house, of my mothers and sisters. In spite of his name, he is a modern. He swims with the tide. I was at once offered a post at a court and compelled to mix with men of my father's opinions, and I could not bear it. I promised my father to follow any profession, to enter on any way of life that did not entail my bending my pride so low, my living in a nest of lies, eating them, breathing them, lying down at night with them. "Any life?" said my father. "Any life," I answered. "A Chernovitsky never breaks his word," said he. "Nor binds himself to false oaths," said I. That was the end. I left my father at his government office, and on my return to the hotel of my brother, a note awaited me. It announced that this— the young man waved his arm in the direction of his narrow bed and single prie-dieu— was my father's choice for me. For 15 months I have seen no one belonging to the world I love. No one till you came, mademoiselle. Your chance visit— I think you have dropped from the skies— excites all my old longing for the life I have left. Why not leave this life and go back to Paris? Cut yourself off from your family— you are cut off from them now— and make your own life what you please." The brother smiled and shook his head, looking dreamily into the elm branches that smothered the root of my spire. "Do you know Paris?" he said wistfully. "Well, I have just left there." "And you return?" he said with sudden eagerness. "Oh, in about 3 months, perhaps." "Mademoiselle, you have it in your power to do me the greatest possible service. You comprehend? The greatest possible service. Will you do it? It will not trouble you much, you who have fallen from the clouds to give me comfort. Will you do it?" He was extraordinarily excited. His face, which was pale, flushed a very dark color, and he panted as he spoke. I stood away from the cold stone balustrade on which I had been leaning during this remarkable interview, and put a foot over the threshold of his cell. "But certainly I will do it. I will do anything in my power that will really serve you," I said. "Only tell me—" A bell, such a nasty, tinny, ascetic, inhuman sort of bell, rang out from the spire. The young man looked nervously towards his window, but began speaking rapidly to me as though time were precious. "I left Paris hastily, as you have heard. There was not time to see or explain to all my friends. One of them— Mademoiselle, I am trusting you, and speaking with my soul, and yet even a dead man hesitates to talk of that which is in his heart's lining, so to say. But I have thought so much, and there is no way. My mother, my sisters would not help me, even if I could get word to them. But letters are inspected, and sacred God, I am supposed to have given up such thoughts. You cannot mean that you are going to spend all your life here, doing nothing. Oh, do not be so mad. Come away now. No one saw me enter, none will see you go out. Come, and let me help you back to Paris. I have money if you need it. Let me help you back to the lady you have not forgotten." It was a venture, but I never was surer of anything than that lady's existence when I spoke. He stooped with a strange, graceful suddenness and kissed my hand. "Dear lady," he said, "there is my oath," and the words choked him as he said them. "But time is short. Let me think. A brother might pass at any moment. I must write a letter, and I am afraid it is too hard for you to find her and to deliver it. She may not be in the same place. She may be— No, God is not cruel. She is not married." The simple faith of that man's voice as he said these last words is what I have never heard nor ever expect to hear the like of. I knew very soon I should be crying. "Well, won't you write?" I said. "I will find her. Tell me only your name," I added, with a sudden inspiration, "and be quick and write the letter." He had already found his paper and pen. It was a stiff, curious piece of paper, and he was flinging words upon it. "I am Stanislav Chernovitsky, Count of the province of— You are Brother Stanislav, of the Order of the White Brothers of Jesus and John," said a voice in the corridor. I have never been so startled in my life as when, with chill, frozen slowness, I turned and saw that white man standing behind me. It was not for myself I was frightened, for nothing could happen to me, but the poor Count and his half-written letter. For 10 seconds, 15 perhaps, no one spoke. I admit I had quite lost my head, but it only struck me that all Poles do not know German, and I assumed that the superior did not and that the Count did. "For heaven's sake, the address, only the address," I exclaimed, with the stray South German accent of my school days, which recurs to me in moments of excitement. But the Count's hand had fallen to his sides, and the newcomer was addressing him over my head in Polish and with great severity. I knew it was about me, but my wits had not come back to me quite, or I would have behaved with more dignity. I put out my hand for the letter. "The name, just the bare name," I said wildly. "Ah, no. Go, madame. Pray go, I beg of you." It was the Count speaking with strange, bitter self-possession, and that should have brought me to myself. I turned to the superior. I do not know exactly what I said, but I smiled in my nervousness, actually smiled on the horrid creature who had appeared so inopportunely. "Madam, of your goodness, go, and thank you," said the soft voice of the Count behind me. And without a word more I went, down the stairs and out into the court unmolested, and the slamming of one heavy door, that of the Count's cell I felt sure, was the sound that followed me into the sunshine. End of A Cowl in Cracow by Minnie Muriel Dowie.